There was a really interesting thread that popped up on EN World and then kind of went away. And I was sad because it was a really good question. And the question was how and when to fudge. I've made a joke commonly. People say, do you ever cheat on dice rolls? And I say, I don't cheat on dice rolls. I cheat everywhere else. And, it's kind of my little funny gag, but it's also how I feel about the cheating and fudging. And people are like, what do we call cheating? And what do we call fudging? What does that even mean? And which word is right? I'm going to go with fudge. I'm going to go with fudging. That you're shifting things a little bit. You're moving things around. It's not cheating because you can't really cheat as a GM, right? Like rule 0, you can't really cheat. But, you can, and you can't really cheat. You can't really, but you can fudge things. You can kind of go against. So what is, when we think about this conversation, when and how and under what circumstances and how do you do it and why what is it even like? What even counts as fudging? And I think you can narrow fudging down to changing things in the game during the game. I'm pretty sure everyone would agree you can't really fudge things during prep. Even if you're modifying monsters, you're changing spells, you're deciding how many monsters are in or out, you're shifting layouts, you're cutting off parts of dungeons, you're changing your maps. Pretty much everything you can do on the GM side during prep. I don't know that very many people, I would assume the vast majority of GMs would recognize that during prep, everything goes. You want to modify a monster? Modify a monster. You want to change magic items? You change magic items. You want to shift things around? That's not fudging. That's just design. That's just GMing, right? That's a lot of people in the thread said, everything you said is fudging. I consider to be good GMing. And they're like, well, they're not mutually exclusive. Counting as fudging is really changing the game during the game, I think is where people start to talk about fudging. And what doesn't count is anything that you do during prep. Doesn't really count. And an interesting one is when you start to talk to the old school gaming group about what counts as fudging for them. They do not consider rolling the dice and coming up with ideas by the die roll during a game as fudging either. It's kind of funny though, if you think about it. It's like, well, if I come up with something out of my head, that's fudging or cheating. But if I roll a die and it comes up with something, that's just how the game works. And maybe that makes sense, right? Because you're building a stochastic system. You're building a randomly based world where none of us know how this is going to go. And I'm appreciative of that. I think that rolling random encounters is cool. I think the idea of rolling attitudes is cool. The idea of rolling distances and whether or not who is surprising who, all those kind of things, and using the dice to help determine that, I think can be really cool. Sometimes, however, it's not cool. Sometimes you end up having a whole bunch of sloggy fights right in a row because you rolled a certain way. That would kind of suck, right? And now no one's having fun. You're not having fun. The players aren't having fun. And that's where you might want to fudge. So that doesn't count. Why would you fudge is a good question. And I have some thoughts about this, and I'm sure you have some thoughts. And these are just my ideas. I'm not saying this is the way it is. You get to decide what makes sense for you. But I'm going to offer my own thoughts on it. Why fudge? To change the fun and the pacing of the game is one reason why you would fudge. To keep things moving along, to move the game forward is a reason to fudge. And to help the mechanics of the game meet the story of the game. Sometimes the mechanics slip away from the story or the way things ought to be in the world because the mechanics are weird. And in that case, you might want to fudge. Those are some reasons why I think it's okay. When would you not want to fudge? What are some things where you don't want to fudge? And I would say you don't want to fudge to remove agency from a character or a player. This is that idea of, oh, this monster's immune to all of your BS, right? Why? Because I say so. Because I don't want my boss to get hit by all your BS. That's not great. You shouldn't fudge when you're mad. Just because something happened and you don't like it, you're fudging. And you shouldn't fudge because you can, right? Fudging is not something that you should just do. You should have a good reason for doing it. I would also say that fudging in order to force the characters down a particular path is not great either. If you have an idea for the way the story is going to go and it's not going that way, and you're fudging to keep making sure it goes that way, that's probably not great. You probably also have a bigger problem than the fact that you're fudging. You also have the problem that you over-prepped down one path, and that now you're kind of forcing everything down that one path. So those, I would say, are not areas where fudging is great. So where do you fudge? Where can you change things? Well, there's a few different places. What does success or failure look like on an ability check? Is an area where you can fudge. This isn't something that we think about commonly, but you get to decide what success and failure looks like. And the example is, if the rogue is failing to pick a lock, maybe he still gets the door open, but he broke his picks. Or maybe he got the door open, but it was loud and now people have heard stuff. Is it fudging? I mean, I bet you that not a lot of people would think of that as fudging. They're like, no, that's just rolling with the game, right? You're supposed to come up with stuff like that. But if you get to determine how brutal the success or failures in an ability check is, you're really kind of changing things. Particularly if you had one idea before the roll and then you change that idea after the roll. That would be an example. Changing the result of random encounters. If you're rolling on random tables, but then you're like, oh, that's too many, or I don't like that one. Well, now you're fudging again. But there's probably a good reason for it. Oh, God, they fought zombies 3 times in a row. Am I really going to roll another zombie encounter? Maybe I'm going to change this to another encounter. And a lot of games will tell you, go ahead and roll again if you don't like what you get. That's kind of fudging, right? That seems like it's okay. In combat in particular, I have the dials of monster difficulty. I wrote about those in Lazy DM's Companion. I wrote about them in Forge of Foes. Hit points, damage, the number of attacks, and the number of monsters are dials that you can turn during combat to change the pacing of a game. I've talked a lot about this, and one of the key points of those dials I'm going to get to in a moment, which is that those dials, you don't just turn them willy-nilly. You turn the dials when you need to, when you have a reason to turn the dials. That's when you turn them. But they all spring to center, right? They should have resistance in them. That idea of resistance in the dials is something we're going to talk about. But those are common ways to fudge. One common topic that comes up often when we talk about fudging is the idea that is known as the quantum ogre. The quantum ogre is the idea that you build an ogre encounter ahead of time, and then whatever path the characters take, they still run into the same ogre. I had a situation where the characters were going down a bunch of different paths in the mountains, or they were in these caves, and I knew I was going to run a serpent cult encounter. I had my minis set up. I had a beautiful dwarven forge set up. I had all this stuff, and I'm like, whatever direction they're going, they're going to run into this. And the players joked, like, as soon as they peeked in and they went, wow, look at this crazy serpent shrine with all these people. We should go down one of the other paths. And I was like, you can. I bet you it takes you right to that same door. And they're like, oh, it's the Quantum Serpent Temple. Like, whatever direction we go. And I'm like, man, I spent an hour building this Dwarven Forge setup. And it was also like, you want to do this, right? You want to enjoy your characters fighting snake cults. Just do it. But there was this definite like meta-gamey joke about like, oh, I bet that whatever direction we go. But that idea of building encounters that then you force on the players by whatever direction they go is often a source of criticism. I don't really criticize Quantum Ogre. I don't think that's so bad. I think building flexible encounters that you can drop into different places is also a very common GM technique that is often brought up many times as good advice for GMs. So I don't think there's anything about that. So the dials. Right? If we think about fudging as lever, like we are, very common metaphor for GMing is we're the man behind the curtain. We're the great and mighty Oz. We're behind the curtain, dorking with levers and wheels and turns, and there's a great big head that's saying things like it's true, and we're like, messing with the dials and pulling the levers. That's a pretty apt metaphor. I like it. And one of the things we can think about when we are pulling those levers and moving the dials is that they have resistance to them. They aren't just these floppy dials and floppy levers and dials with no springs, and they're all over the place and everything's topsy-turvy. Who knows how many hit points monsters have. We're just turning things left and right. Instead, all of them balance to center. They all balance to the way that it is at first. And then we pull them and they have resistance to them. And they will spring back into place. To kind of expand this metaphor, it means that we shouldn't be changing monster hit points unless we have a good reason to do it. And many times we just use what it says, but sometimes we turn it. And sometimes it has more resistance one way than the other. The hit point dial, for example, has more resistance when you increase it than it does when you decrease it. You should be pretty free about decreasing hit points for the pacing of the game. Increasing is really that idea of like, this monster had a bigger tale to tell in this story, and they just nuked it with alpha striking. And everyone will be disappointed if this monster drops too fast. I'm going to go ahead and increase its hit points, right? That's not an unreasonable reason, but that's a stronger turn on that dial. So I often say that we should start first with what makes sense in the world. And that could be random rolls on the tables. It could be whatever the base stats are of monsters that we're dealing with. Whatever makes sense in the world is what we should start with when we're considering acting as a conduit to this world during our game. But we should be willing to bend it for the fun of the players and for the fun of the game. That includes us, right? We should be willing to change it when it increases the fun. If the fun already looks pretty solid, then you just stick with what makes sense in the world. But sometimes you're like, well, what's in the world is actually going to be lamer than if I just turn one of these dials or pull one of these levers in order to make things a little differently. And that's really what our job as a GM. Now, whether you consider that fudging or not is really up to you, and whether you have a problem with that is up to you. And I'm sure many GMs have different feelings about all of this stuff. I know they do. And I'm not saying my way is the right way, but I am saying that these are some considerations for when you're thinking about when and where and how to fudge, what fudging even is, and most particularly why you do it. So that's my thought on fudging, when and how to do it, and how to do it to make our games the most fun. If you enjoyed this show, please consider subscribing to the Sly Flourish newsletter. You get your Sly Flourish adventure generator and a 3-sheet, 6-page role-playing game system absolutely free for signing up for the newsletter. Link for that's in the show notes. You can join the Patreon and get access to all kinds of tips, tricks, tools, resources to help you run your games, plus access to the awesome Discord community and of the awesome Sly Flourish Discord community. And you help me directly support this show. And you can pick up any of my books at the Sly Flourish bookstore, including Forge of Foes, Lazy DM's Companion, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, Lazy DM's Workbook, City of Arches, and more on the Sly Flourish bookstore. Thank you all so much. Have a great day, and get out there and play a role-playing game.